a shocking and costly gamble to save Burkina Faso. The first whispers began in the markets of Ouagadougou, where traders spoke of low-flying military helicopters carrying massive crates instead of soldiers, their rotors kicking up clouds of red dust over the savannah. At first, people thought it was another military exercise, or perhaps a relief drop from some foreign agency. But when the first farmers arrived at their fields in the following days, they found the ground speckled with thousands of seeds, maize, wheat, peanuts, cassava, millet scattered across the dry, cracked earth as far as the eye could see. A bizarre sight in a land where planting was usually done by hand in neat, tight rows. The truth revealed only to a select inner circle was that President Ibrahim Traoré had authorized one of the most ambitious and unconventional agricultural operations in African history. A 100-ton aerial seed drop over Burkina Faso's drought-stricken grasslands. A move that baffled his own ministers, enraged international development partners, and terrified foreign grain exporters whose dominance over African food markets depended on countries like Burkina Faso staying dependent. Officially, it was a humanitarian mission to combat the crippling effects of the third consecutive year of erratic rains, which had left both people and wildlife struggling to survive. But in reality, it was something far more calculated. A multi-layered gamble designed to break the cycle of imported dependency, restore degraded ecosystems, and ignite a self-sustaining agricultural boom that would feed not just Burkina Faso but its neighbors. Traoré knew the risks. The cost alone was staggering, involving the chartering of helicopters, the purchase of drought-resistant seed varieties from multiple regional suppliers, and the coordination of hundreds of drop zones. And critics were quick to pounce, calling it a reckless spectacle that would be eaten by birds before it sprouted. But the president had anticipated these attacks and built his plan accordingly. Hidden within the mix were carefully selected seed strains developed in partnership with African agronomists, quick germinating millet to provide forage for wildlife within weeks, deep-rooted cassava that could thrive in poor soils for months, and hardy maize hybrids capable of producing a harvest even with minimal rainfall. Each seed type strategically clustered in specific ecozones so they would complement, not compete with each other. The plan's genius, however, was not just in the science, but in the politics. By conducting the operation entirely with domestic resources and regional partners, Traoré denied foreign aid agencies any control over the narrative. And by tying the seed drop to both human food security and wildlife conservation, he made it politically toxic for foreign governments to oppose without appearing to be against feeding the hungry or protecting endangered species. Still, the enemies of his vision were moving. Grain import lobbies in Europe and North America began whispering to their governments about market destabilization, and aid agencies hinted at ecological concerns in press briefings, trying to stir doubts about the safety of mass seed dispersal. Inside Burkina Faso, some members of the cabinet quietly questioned the wisdom of spending so much on something so experimental, especially when the treasury was under strain from infrastructure projects and defense costs. But Traoré remained unmoved, holding private strategy sessions in the war room of the palace, where maps of the country were overlaid with satellite rainfall predictions, soil quality grids, and migration patterns of both humans and animals. In one such meeting, he reportedly told his advisors, "If the rains come, we will feed ourselves. If they don't, the roots will hold our soil and our hope until they do. Either way, we stopped begging for bread at someone else's table." And so over the course of a week in the late dry season, the skies over Burkina Faso's vast sun-bleached plains buzzed with the sound of rotor blades scattering life into the wind, and with it the first seeds of a new kind of independence. Under the relentless heat of the Sahel sun, the first weeks after the 100-ton aerial seed drop passed in tense uncertainty, with even Traoré's staunchest allies feeling the weight of doubt. Foreign media had moved fast to seize the narrative. Their satellite photos splashed across headlines in Paris, London, and Washington, showing nothing but cracked earth, brown dust, and the same parched savanna that had plagued Burkina Faso for years. Traoré's folly read one French headline, calling it an expensive spectacle for the cameras and hinting that the president's real goal was to score political points rather than feed his people. Grain lobbyists in Europe and North America were quick to echo the ridicule, their press releases dripping with feigned concern about ecological risks and market destabilization, careful never to admit that what they truly feared was losing their stranglehold on African grain imports. Inside Burkina Faso, the political opposition wasted no time pacing rumors through radio call-ins and market gossip that the helicopters had dropped expired seeds, bought cheaply on the black market, or worse, that the operation was a covert experiment with genetically altered crops that would poison the soil. In Ouagadougou's cafes, whispers about corruption began to circulate. But out in the rural provinces, where skepticism was tempered by desperation, farmers and herders were watching the skies with their own kind of prayer, waiting for a sign. And then, on the 12th night after the drop, it came. Dark clouds rolled in from the northeast, the air heavy with the scent of rain, and for hours a steady, soaking drizzle blanketed the land from the dusty borders of Mali to the lowlands of the southwest. When the sun rose again, the first subtle change could be seen. Here and there, faint green threads were pushing through the soil, almost invisible at first, but multiplying with each passing day. In the semi-arid Sahel belt, quick germinating millet had sprung up in wide swaths, its pale shoots rippling in the breeze, and by the end of the second week, herds of gazelle and wandering cattle were returning to graze where they had not found forage in years. In the land-flood plains, cassava was breaking the surface, its deep taproots already pulling moisture from beneath the earth, while in the west, maize stalks were thrusting upward, their leaves unfurling in defiance of the drought. These were not random miracles. Traoré's team had mapped microclimates with precision, pairing each seed type with zones where soil, chemistry, humidity, and even wind patterns would give it the best chance of survival. Scientists from the National Agricultural Research Institute, working quietly to avoid foreign meddling, began recording germination rates far above lab projections, in some cases exceeding 80% despite the meager rainfall. They sent their reports to the palace encrypted. PR made any public pronouncement, but not everyone was celebrating. In the eastern province of Gorma, disaster struck when a storage depot holding surplus seed stock was set ablaze in the dead of night. The flames turning the sky orange and wiping out reserves meant for a second phase of planting. Local witnesses claimed they saw men with foreign accents fleeing toward the border. And an investigation by military intelligence traced the operation back to mercenaries on the payroll of a multinational agribusiness recently cut off from Burkina Faso's import contracts. The arson was a warning, but it also confirmed what Traoré already knew. The fight for food sovereignty was no longer just about crops, it was about power. And those who profited from Africa's dependence would not surrender without sabotage. In an emergency meeting inside the war room of the presidential palace, maps were unfurled, rainfall projections updated, and the decision made to immediately deploy replacement seeds to the most promising regions, this time under military guard. Traoré also sent discreet envoys to Niger, Mali, and Ghana with a bold proposal. Join the aerial seeding initiative and commit to sourcing the bulk of grain for regional trade from African producers. It was a master stroke of political judo, turning what began as a domestic gamble into a Pan-African project, making it exponentially harder for hostile powers to retaliate without appearing to punish an entire region. While his enemies plotted in boardrooms and embassies, Traoré was already thinking several moves ahead. With the first shoots maturing, he would integrate the sudden abundance of forage into an accelerated livestock expansion program, boosting meat and dairy production while using manure to restore soil fertility, and close the loop on food production. Even if only half the seeded areas reached harvest, the ripple effects would be enough to shift market dynamics, cut import dependency, and ignite rural economies long neglected by foreign aid models. But the very brilliance of the plan guaranteed that the danger would escalate. Intelligence intercepts suggested that certain foreign interests were now discussing regime change scenarios before the harvest could prove Traoré right. And somewhere beyond Burkina Faso's green shoots and grazing herds, men in tailored suits and shadowy operatives were already drafting the next move in a quiet war over Africa's future. The third month after the seed drop should have been a period of quiet consolidation, an agricultural project entering its growth phase, but instead it became the most dangerous stretch of Ibrahim Traoré's presidency. The green tide was spreading faster than even his closest advisors had dared to hope. From the sky, drones captured breathtaking footage of maize fields, shimmering like gold under the sun, peanut plants forming dense carpet across the lands, and millet swaying in the Sahel breeze. These images, when broadcast on state television, ignited a wave of optimism inside Burkina Faso and a spark of envy across the region. Neighboring governments began sending delegations, some openly offering cooperation, others fishing for intelligence to replicate the strategy. But with the attention came risk, and the risk turned deadly when Traoré's intelligence chief, Colonel Issoufou, intercepted encrypted communications from a private security network in Abbey, January. The message was blunt: harvest must not happen. Stop it at the source. Intercepted follow-up chatter spoke of neutralizing key figures in the operation. And while no names were listed, everyone in the palace understood the first target would be Traoré himself. This was not paranoia. Only a year earlier, a foreign mercenary team had attempted to breach the palace under the guise of a humanitarian convoy. That plot failed, but the lesson stuck. When economic independence threatens entrenched interests, assassination becomes a tool of policy. Security protocols were tightened overnight. The president's public appearances were slashed, his movements disguised through decoy convoys. Even the inspection tours of the green zones were now conducted in unmarked helicopters, with the official aircraft flying in a different direction as a diversion. Yet, Traoré refused to hide in fear. In a surprise move, he appeared without prior notice in the small town of Dori, walking among the newly sprouted millet fields and speaking directly with farmers. "No one owns the sky here except our people," he told them. A pointed reference to the foreign drones spotted hovering near drop zones weeks earlier. The visit electrified the countryside, but enraged his enemies, who now saw that killing him in a city would spark unrest. Rural Burkina Faso had become his fortress, but the attacks shifted in method. In late July, bags of seed intended for the second drop in Mali were found laced with a chemical treatment that would render the seeds sterile. It was a sophisticated sabotage requiring access to specialized agricultural toxins not sold in West Africa. Forensic analysis traced the compound to a European supplier with deep ties to an international grain cartel. Publicly, Traoré said nothing. Privately, he authorized Operation Iron Canopy, a covert sweep to identify and expel all foreign operatives posing as NGO workers in the agricultural belt. Within 3 weeks, 14 aid consultants had quietly been escorted to the border, their laptops and satellite phones confiscated for analysis. Inside their files, palace analysts found contracts and wire transfers, linking them to lobbying groups whose members had been calling for sanctions against Burkina Faso since the day the seed drop was announced. The pressure campaign intensified on the diplomatic front. Burkina Faso's gold exports to Europe were suddenly delayed by new compliance rules. Development loans in the pipeline from 2 major African banks were frozen under vague governance concerns. In New York, a closed-door meeting of the UN Food Security Council, supposedly convened to address the Sahel drought, descended into a thinly veiled inquisition about the legality of aerial environmental interventions, code for the seed drop. Through it all, Traoré held his ground. He knew that if he blinked now, the entire continent would see it as proof that even the boldest African leadership must kneel when pressed. So he played the long game, quietly diverting gold sales to Asian buyers, brokering a barter agreement with Turkey for farm equipment in exchange for sesame oil, and securing a shipment of drought-resistant wheat seed from Egypt under a cultural exchange program to dodge trade monitoring. The threats were no longer theoretical when Colonel Isufu informed him of a credible plot. An explosives expert flown in from outside Africa had crossed into the country through a porous northern border. His target was the central grain storage hub at Kaya. Destroying it would wipe out 40% of the expected harvest. Traoré's response was surgical. Rather than broadcast panic, he personally oversaw a decoy operation, moving a large portion of the stored grain under cover of night to undisclosed locations, while leaving behind sacks filled with sand and dried grass under tarps. When the saboteur finally struck, the explosion lit up the sky and foreign media ran headlines of catastrophic loss. But the next morning, Traoré appeared on national television in front of the untouched real reserves, smiling faintly. "Our enemies think in terms of destruction. We think in terms of protection," he said, turning what could have been a crippling blow into a morale-boosting victory. By now, the gamble had shifted from agricultural experiment to political war. Traor's survival, both physical and political, had become intertwined with the fate of the fields. Each growing stalk was now a defiance against foreign monopolies. Each green acre a statement that Burkina Faso could feed itself without the benevolence of its former masters. And as whispers grew that harvest season would be the final proof of his success, his enemies prepared for one last desperate move to ensure that proof never came. The heat over the Burkina Bay plains shimmered like a mirage as harvest season drew near, and for Ibrahim Traoré, the final weeks felt like walking a tightrope strung between triumph and annihilation. The fields, once barren stretches of ochre dust, now rolled in waves of green and gold. Maize heavy with kernels, groundnuts peeking from the soil, cassava leaves spread wide. And in villages where hunger had been a constant shadow, laughter returned to evening fires. But the closer the harvest came, the more intelligence reports spoke of the final strike, a coordinated attempt to break the back of the operation before its success could be sealed into the national memory. And this time it was not a single mercenary or a lone saboteur, but a multi-pronged offensive. Bribes to local officials to delay grain collection whispered threats to truck drivers that moving the harvest meant risking their lives. Foreign agents posing as traders offering inflated prices to lure farmers into smuggling their yield across borders. And most alarming of all, a credible threat to poison the main irrigation channels supplying the densest crop zones. Traoré convened his war council behind the thick walls of the palace's underground command room, the air thick with the smell of strong coffee and dust carried in from the soldiers' boots. And as maps of the country flickered on digital screens, the president spoke not with panic, but with the same cold precision he'd shown on the battlefield. "We will not defend crops like they are fragile. We will defend them like we defend the flag." Operation Harvest Shield went into effect before dawn the next day. Armored convoys escorted grain trucks, special forces in unmarked fatigues embedded in villages. The irrigation channels were sealed and rerouted through hidden pipes laid months earlier as part of a future proofing plan no one had thought would be used this soon. And in the markets of Ouagadougou, undercover agents posed as grain buyers to identify and arrest the middlemen attempting to bleed the harvest out of the country. The enemy, sensing their window closing, pushed harder. A convoy of humanitarian aid trucks was intercepted on the border with Niger, its cargo hold hiding chemical drums labeled as cooking oil, but containing industrial pesticides strong enough to contaminate thousands of hectares. And in the west, a makeshift airstrip was discovered where light aircraft had been prepared for a nighttime firebombing run on the largest maize belt. Both plots were dismantled before they could launch, but the message was clear. This was no longer just about food. This was about the right of an African nation to claim its own future without permission. Traoré understood the symbolism and decided to raise the stakes. 3 days before the official harvest, he appeared live on national television, not from the safety of the capital, but from the heart of the fields in Kaya, flanked by farmers, soldiers, and herders, the ripe crops stretching endlessly behind them. And in a voice steady but edged with defiance, he said, This is not just Burkina Faso's harvest, this is Africa's harvest, and it will not be stolen. The broadcast was carried not just on local networks, but on sympathetic African media channels from Bamako to Dar es Salaam, and within hours, volunteer militias and village defense groups across the country began guarding the fields unarmed but unyielding, forming human walls around the land until the grain was safely cut, bagged, and stored. The final act came quietly in the early hours of the harvest day. Intelligence picked up a last-minute move by foreign handlers to detonate explosives along the main highway to the central storage hub, a strike meant to strand the yield in the countryside and rot it under the sun. But thanks to a miscalculation, they hit an empty decoy route. The real convoys already rerouted under cover of a dust storm that seemed almost summoned by the land itself. By nightfall, the first trucks rolled into the storage complexes, their beds piled high with sacks of grain, the air filled with the scent of new maize. And in that moment, the gamble was no longer a gamble, but a victory. Foreign news outlets grudgingly called it a logistical feat under hostile conditions, while in the villages it was spoken of simply as the year the land fought back. For Traoré, the win was not just measured in tons of grain or the stabilizing of livestock herds fattened on the restored grasslands, but in the shift he could feel in the people, the knowledge that they had faced drought, sabotage, and political siege, and emerged not as victims of charity, but as authors of their own survival. The seed drop, once mocked as a reckless stunt, had become the first chapter of a long campaign to reimagine Burkina Faso's agriculture as a weapon of independence. And as the president walked between stacked grain sacks under the glow of floodlights that night, he knew the war was far from over. But for the first time in decades, the nation was no longer fighting on an empty stomach, and that in Africa's quiet war for sovereignty was the most dangerous victory of all.